Tonight's headlines for a special train wreck edition on CBS News. Head-on collision near the Allentown interlocking. 4 dead and 2 others injured. The catastrophe of the copycat collisions. Learn the history on Richard Lynn Gates and his deception on the corridor. Dazed and confused. A fatal answer that leaves 4 crew members burned to death while the brother of the victim is clinically distraught with anger and fear after the collision. Strike 3 runaways? CBS goes behind the scenes on how Cajon Pass could be a cataclysmic mistake for railroad operators. Railroad crossings. Is the problem lack of intuition or lack of common sense? We take you to 4 causes of mechanical or human error and take a look back at the worst passenger and freight train wrecks, derailments, collisions, and disasters from over the years. How one organization can mean the difference between life and death. This is the CBS Evening News, with Dan Rather reporting tonight from the former Conrail Interlocking Tower at Bryan, Ohio, and Scott Pelley from the CBS Evening News World Headquarters in New York. Continuing on catastrophe on the mainland. Railroads' second chances of all glances. From the Conrail Interlocking Tower in Bryan, Ohio, here is Dan Rather. Good evening for a special train wreck edition of the CBS Evening News. We are looking over the years on how train safety has changed nations' guidelines and requirements for safe operations. The 1988 Thompsontown wreck has become a tragedy of horrors, especially when crew members overwork their hourly shifts and crash and snooze at the throttle, literally. Incredible footage includes removing the dead and wounded. The story has incredibly graphic nature as Bill Whitaker begins our coverage.
As rescue personnel continue to remove the debris from smashed glass windows and crushed steel, many questions remain. How did this fatal head-on collision occur? NTSB sources say both engineers of the Northeast Conrail coal train and the Southwest piggyback crashed at the throttles at around 7:38 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Both engineers had missed 3 warning signals and 2 stop signals before the collision took place. Sources from the National Transportation Safety Board say at around 7:05 a.m., both trains collided at a combined speed of 165 miles per hour. The force of the impact all but demolished all 5 Conrail locomotives. The piggyback train, labeled TV2, was pulled by 2 Electromotive Division SD40s, numbers 6349 and 6265. The Northwest Coal train was pulled by an EMD GP40, number 3054, a GP40-2, number 3394, and a General Electric B36-7, number 5017. All 4 models had surprisingly, at the time, consistent safety and maintenance records. The incident occurred around 6:45 a.m. when both engineers fell asleep at the throttles of their lead locomotives. The dispatcher had no idea that the speeds went way above the normal speed limit through occupied locks. The piggyback train excelled to over 87 miles per hour and the coal train at 66 miles per hour. The conductors couldn't have done anything else, and they had no time that seconds later both trains crashed in a fatally fiery head-on collision at Thompsontown. All 5 locomotives were totaled at the scene. The NTSB confirmed that sleep deprivation was the cause of the accident. FRA officials spoke to a few news stations during televised interviews. This wasn't the first time the Conrail history had scandals hit the railroad. A stoned engineer was convicted of manslaughter by locomotive after he plowed his locomotives into the Colonial, an Amtrak passenger train on the Northeast Corridor. The combined speed at over 180 when the 2 trains derailed was horrific. 3 of the 5 locomotives were totaled and headed for the scrapyard. 16 people were killed, and 170 survived with critical injuries and emotional trauma. NTSB confirmed that regulations were forever changed after the collision. Medical testing was strictly upheld because of laws that were passed by Congress to take in consideration that deprivation, drugs, or alcohol will not be tolerated on the main line. Investigators are hoping that sooner new regulations will take place sooner than later, but for now, it's only a prominent possibility. Bill Whitaker, CBS News at the Allentown Cutoff in Thompsontown, Pennsylvania.
This is not the first time that Conrail had brushes with the law. The 1987 wreck in Chase, Maryland brought closure and emotions to the victims of the tragic aftermath of the Northeast Colonial and the trio of the Conrail B36-7s. An engineer was convicted of manslaughter by locomotive and sentenced to federal and state prison terms. Wyatt Andrews reports on how railroads are cracking down medical testing after the dilemma at the Gunpowder Interlocking Tower near Chase, Maryland, and how the railroads pursue the no means no policy in the war on drugs.
It sounded like a warhead detonating near the backyard of the filling station. That's exactly what happened here at this interlocking junction in Chase, Maryland. Richard Lynn Gates, a 14-year veteran for Conrail Penn Central at the time, was ultimately convicted of vehicular manslaughter by locomotive. His DNA and blood samples confirmed traces of marijuana after the collision. He also intentionally disconnected a motion-sensitive alarm in the cab and taped the alarm valve shut of Conrail Unit 5044, a General Electric B36-7. The other two locomotives of the same vintage, 5052 and 5045, were also involved. The Colonial's two Amtrak AEM-7 locomotives, 903 and 900, suffered maximal damage and were totaled from critical frame and body damages. 5045 was charred to pieces after the five locomotives impacted a combined speed of over 180 miles per hour. The other gentleman, Edward Butch Cromwell, later resigned to avoid prosecution in federal court. He testified against Gates, saying that Gates was an absolute disaster. He continued to ignore complaints of drug use and concerns about several DUI convictions. I would not be surprised if the feds and state went hard on him to permanently banish him from working on any railroads or any railroad property, he said. But railroads have taken critical notice of any drug or alcohol incidents and have prioritized medical testing be mandatory for first-year rookies and even veterans of the rails. The dangers are imminent. If you are on drugs or drinking alcohol at the throttle, the damages are more maximal and more fatal than drinking at the controls in the drive of the wheel of your own automobile. And arrests are more critical, and fines can reach over the $500,000 to over $15 million in restitutions, fines, and extreme property damages to any and all equipment to all beginnings of railroads in Class 1, 2, 3, and Industrial. Wyatt Andrews, CBS News, Washington.
With sleep deprivation becoming an epidemic for travel, many people are worried of the true dangers to railroading, frightened that their rest periods could very well be their last and never wake up again. And Sugar Valley, Georgia, just outside of Davis, that became an absolute nightmare for Norfolk Southern and its predecessors. The 1990 reports filed receivership to protect assets and liabilities from being exploited by points of the federal courts. How was Norfolk Southern fortunate to survive a critical impact that killed 4 crew members and critically injured 2? There's more that meets the story, as our NTSB correspondent Bob Orr reports.
It sounded like a fireworks factory detonating over 700 quintillion tons of fireworks, with the sounds and smells of a filling station, that ultimately led to 2 individuals to permanent retirement due to critically emotional trauma. John McDaniel and Oliver Forrester are no longer involved with Norfolk Southern. Oliver sat through in a very emotional interview with Scott Pelley on 60 Minutes 2 to describe his horrors on how his brother perished in 5th and 6th degree burns. He was too emotional to talk, but did agree to write in a 45-paper document, "It was horrendous. My role model and older brother has perished. I couldn't do anything else but scream and bawl in tears over my brother's loss. Also lost Richard Cohart due to 6th degree burns and being beaten and thrown around like a rag doll before perishing in the horrendous pool of gasoline, nitric acid, and yellow phosphorus. My career with the railroad is over and over for good. I absolutely do not want to relive those days ever again because of the loss of my best friend and old brother are too fresh to relive. I hope NS does critical improvements so sleep deprivation never occurs at the throttle again." The models in this train wreck included an EMD High Hood GP38 number 2799, a High Hooded General Electric B23-7 number 3994, and 2 General Electric C39-8s, 8641 and 8621. 3 of the 4 units in this wreck did not have a good safety record. 2799 suffered the most costliest of damages due to body fire damage, frame corrosion, and its fuel tank shooting out like a missile that was used in the war in the Persian Gulf. The train for G38 was a mixed intermodal train mixed with single and double stack container and piggyback trailers. The cargo for 188 was a mixed hazardous material merchandiser, including placards were as followed: 1.3 explosives with cards J, K, L, and S, flammable gases and liquids, and flammable solids. Also included were spontaneously combustible solids, dangerous when wet materials, organic peroxides in category 5.2, toxic chemicals in 6.1, corrosive additives like nitric and hydrochloric acids, and alkalines such as sodium and potassium hydroxides, and miscellaneous cargoes like asbestos mixed with 2 more properties such as barium azide and mercury azide in dangerous mixed loads. for those hazmat materials classes 8, 9, and 9.3. Damages from both trains were estimated at over $33 million in damages for both freight trains at the adjacent woods, nearing 40 acres of forest. The NTSB confirmed that sleep deprivation was a problem with NS from the beginning. Since '87, NS could face federal lawsuits that could banish its crew and operating on its home turf. 8621 was the lone and sole survivor of the collision. It was rebuilt after 3 months and operated up until around 2019. The other 3 models were simply scrapped and melted down because they were totally demolished beyond recognition. Interesting factor is that the emergency brakes were turned on the night of the crash, but the other 3 brakes before the fatal moment of impact. But even with government spending, many hundreds of thousands of hours would be needed to improve safety conditions, so its locomotives and crewmen wouldn't be lowered to venture onto rails that are not familiar with trackage rates. The trackage rates that could prove a difference between life and death. Bob Orr, CBS News, Washington.